In the rugged and dusty town of Silver Ridge, a group of bandits rides in looking for trouble, hoping to shake down the townsfolk and claim what's not theirs. They spot a quiet drifter, a man in a weathered poncho, sitting alone in the local saloon. Thinking him to be an easy target, they move to subdue him. What they don't realize is that the quiet man is the town's deadliest shot, a man with a past he'd rather forget. When the bandits push too far, they'll learn the hard way that this drifter is not someone you want to cross. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. Silver Ridge was the kind of town that only looked good when you weren't standing in the middle of it. The dry, cracked earth was covered with dust and the scent of sagebrush, while the few wooden buildings seemed to sag under the weight of years without care. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a long, harsh shadow over the town's main street, where the wind kicked up little cyclones of dirt and dried leaves. Most days, the town was quiet, just a few souls going about their business and trying to stay out of the heat. But today, there was a feeling in the air, a sense of something about to happen. The saloon, known as the Rusty Spur, was the heart of Silver Ridge. If you wanted to find anyone in town, they were either at the bar or sitting at a corner table. It was the kind of place where talk was cheap and whiskey was even cheaper. The piano player in the corner wasn't particularly skilled, but he played enough to keep the regulars distracted. A group of 5 men walked in, their spurs clinking on the wooden floor, their eyes scanning the room. They had the look of outlaws, dirty, weather-worn faces, eyes sharp with greed. The leader, a man with a scar running across his face, stopped at the bar and ordered a drink. His companions spread out, taking up positions in the room, their eyes flicking over the patrons like they were looking for something, someone. Whiskey, the scarred man growled as he glanced at the bartender, who, despite the man's gruff tone, served him without hesitation. There was no love lost between the people of Silver Ridge and the kind of men who came into town looking for trouble, but they'd learned long ago that it was best to keep your head down and your mouth shut when the outlaws came around. The man with the scar's eyes darted across the room and landed on a figure sitting at a corner table. A man in a worn poncho, his face half hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. He sat alone, not bothering anyone, sipping slowly from a glass of water. But the outlaws weren't the type to leave anyone alone, especially not someone who looked like they could be an easy target. That one, the scarred man muttered under his breath. He motioned for his men to move, and they slowly made their way over to the stranger's table. The man in the poncho didn't look up. He didn't need to. He knew they were coming. One of the bandits, a younger man with a wild look in his eyes, reached for the stranger's chair, his voice loud and obnoxious. "What's a lone man doing here in Silver Ridge? You lost, stranger?" The man in the poncho's hand didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on his drink, but his fingers tightened on the edge of the glass, as if weighing his options. He had the look of someone who had seen too much and was tired of talking. Another bandit, this one with a crooked grin and a scar running down his neck, stepped in closer. "You better answer him, cowboy. We don't like quiet types around here." He tapped the barrel of his revolver against the back of the stranger's chair. "It'd be best for your health if you do." The man in the poncho's hand finally moved. He placed the glass down on the table gently and then pushed himself up, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. He stood slowly, deliberately, turning his body just enough to face the group of bandits. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said, his voice deep and steady, but with a certain weight to it. His eyes were calm, but there was something about him, a presence that made the men hesitate for just a moment. "Is that so?" The scarred man sneered. "Because I think you're about to get a lot of it, friend. And you don't look like the kind who's gonna walk away without some persuasion." The man in the poncho didn't flinch. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides, and the sound of leather creaking filled the silence. Then, almost too fast to follow, his hand was at his hip, and the revolver was in his grasp. The bandits froze. For a moment, the saloon seemed to hold its breath. The man in the poncho didn't raise his gun. He didn't make any threatening moves. He simply stood there, the barrel of his revolver pointing downward, but but his grip firm and ready. His eyes moved slowly, one by one, from the bandit leader to the others, sizing them up. The scarred man swallowed, his bravado faltering just for a moment. He had been in plenty of fights before, but something about the stranger in the poncho unnerved him. "What's your name, stranger?" the scarred man demanded, trying to regain control of the situation. The man in the poncho didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, calm as ever, his revolver still pointed down at the ground. Then, after a moment, he spoke, his voice as quiet as ever, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Don't matter." The scarred man's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching toward his own revolver. "I think it does. I think you need to learn a lesson about who's in charge here." The man in the poncho didn't blink. "I'm not here to teach you a lesson," he said, his voice low. "But I will make sure you don't walk out of here." The tension in the room was thick. The bandits seemed to recognize something in the stranger's calm demeanor, a feeling that they were standing on the edge of something dangerous. But none of them made a move. "Not yet. Now, you've got two options," the man in the poncho continued, his voice still steady. "You can leave now, and we'll forget this happened. Or, you can make the mistake of drawing your guns." The bandits exchanged uneasy glances. They had the numbers, they had the advantage, except that the stranger had something else. Something they couldn't see. The scarred man sneered. "You think you're fast enough to—" Before he could finish, the man in the poncho's revolver was already in motion. A single shot rang out. The scarred man's hand exploded, his revolver flying from his grasp as he screamed in pain. The other bandits barely had time to react. In a blur, the man in the poncho fired again, dropping the closest one with a shot to the chest. Another shot, and a third man crumpled to the floor. The remaining two bandits froze, their hands hovering over their guns, but they didn't make a move. "Leave," the man in the poncho said, his voice still calm, still steady. "Now." The two remaining bandits didn't hesitate. They turned and fled, their boots pounding against the floor as they rushed toward the door, leaving their fallen comrades behind. The man in the poncho stood still, his revolver still in hand, his chest rising and falling slowly as the adrenaline faded. He didn't look at the bodies on the floor or the mess that had been made. His eyes were fixed on the door, waiting for it to close behind the bandits. The saloon had gone silent again, the piano player's fingers still hovering over the keys, unsure of what to do next. The man in the poncho holstered his revolver, his back straight as he turned back toward his seat. He didn't look at the patrons or the bartender. He simply sat back down, as if nothing had happened. One of the other patrons, a man with a thick beard, stared at him. Who are you?" The man in the poncho didn't answer right away. He just reached for his glass and took a long sip of water. "Don't matter," he finally said, his voice soft. "But you can call me Cole." Cole's fingers tapped lightly on the rim of his glass as the silence in the rusty spur stretched on. His calm demeanor had a way of making everything else seem even louder. The rattling of the piano keys, the clinking of bottles behind the bar, and the hushed murmurs of the townsfolk who had witnessed the quick, brutal confrontation. They all knew what had just happened, but none of them dared to speak it out loud. The two bandits who had fled hadn't returned, and that was a good thing. For now, Cole was left with the aftermath of his actions, the saloon still heavy with tension. "Cole, you're a damn sight faster than I gave you credit for," the bartender, Roy, said, his voice hoarse, clearly impressed but trying to mask the unease in his tone. He wiped down the counter absently, his eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. Cole didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. His reputation in Silver Ridge, much like the dust in the air, was something you couldn't avoid. He wasn't the type to brag, to call attention to himself. He simply let his actions speak louder than any words. It had been years since he'd set foot in a town like this, years since he had drawn his revolver in anger, and years since he'd thought about the life that had come before the poncho, before the quiet years of solitude. His past was something he'd left behind, but the trouble always followed, like a shadow he could never outrun. Cole turned slightly, his eyes catching the reflection of the door in the saloon's dusty mirror. He could see a man entering, tall, broad-shouldered, with a wide-brimmed hat and a slow, deliberate gait. His boots made no sound as they hit the floor, but Cole knew better than to ignore him. His presence filled the room immediately, and it wasn't long before the man's eyes settled on him. The man walked toward Cole's table, a slow, measured pace, his gaze never wavering. He was the kind of person who had been in the business of trouble for years. His clothes were worn, but he carried himself with the sort of quiet authority that marked a man who had seen more than his fair share of gunfights. He didn't need to announce himself. "Cole," the man said as he reached the table, his voice calm but unmistakable. "I didn't think I'd find you here." The townsfolk grew even quieter, as if sensing the shift in the room. A handful of men who had been sitting at the bar exchanged looks. Some of them had already heard the stories about the man in the poncho, the deadliest shot in the West. And then there was this man, tall, broad, and clearly not someone who'd come to Silver Ridge for a friendly chat. Cole slowly set his glass down on the table. His hand didn't hover near his revolver. It was a simple, natural movement, an action that felt familiar to him, even after all these years. He wasn't about to let his guard down, but there was something about this man that didn't scream trouble. "Ryder," Cole said, his voice soft, but with enough weight to it to make the room take notice. "Didn't expect to see you here either. What's it been, 2 years? 3? Ryder chuckled, a low, gravelly sound that filled the space between them. "I'm guessing you haven't missed me much." Cole didn't answer right away. His eyes narrowed just slightly. The past was never something he liked to talk about, but with Ryder standing in front of him, there was no avoiding it. Ryder wasn't just any old gunslinger from the West. He was a man with connections, a man who had once been Cole's closest ally, and someone who knew far too much about the man behind the poncho. "We both know it's been a long time," Cole said, his tone measured. "What's the trouble now, Ryder? This is Silver Ridge. We're both just passing through, aren't we?" Ryder's eyes darkened as he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper, but it was loud enough for Cole to hear. "I wasn't just passing through, Cole, and you're not either. You're here for the same reason I'm here, because we both know that this town's about to become ground zero for something much bigger than a few bandits." Cole stiffened at the mention of a bigger problem. He didn't want to hear it. He had come here to escape, to find a little peace in a place that seemed forgotten by time. But it seemed like peace was never an option. "I'm not in the market for trouble, Ryder," Cole said, his jaw clenched, his eyes flickering to the door as if he were already anticipating the next wave of bandits or worse. "You're free to make your moves, but I don't need to be dragged into whatever mess you've got yourself into." Ryder studied him for a long moment, his eyes sharp. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat and pulled out a worn piece of paper. He unfolded it, laying it flat on the table between them. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, with markings and drawings that made no immediate sense to the townsfolk gathered nearby. But Cole didn't need to ask. He knew exactly what it was. It was a map to something Cole had thought he'd buried long ago. A map to the gold mines in the hills north of Silver Ridge, a hidden treasure that had been lost during the war with the Confederates. Gold that had gone missing after the mine collapsed, and gold that many men had died trying to find. Gold that had once been the reason Cole had become a man who walked the frontier with a gun at his side. "Where did you get this?" Cole asked, his voice tight. Ryder leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that I know where it leads. And I'm not the only one who knows about it. There are others, dangerous ones, looking to claim that gold for themselves." Cole's hand instinctively went to his gun belt, but he didn't pull his weapon. He was thinking, weighing his options. There was no doubt in his mind that the past had caught up with him, and Ryder wasn't the kind of man you could brush aside easily. If Ryder was involved in this, it meant things were more complicated than just a few bandits causing trouble in Silver Ridge. "And if I don't want anything to do with it?" Cole asked, his voice low, but with a note of finality. Ryder's grin was sharp, almost cruel. "You already have everything to do with it, Cole. You're the one they're going to be looking for." The tension in the room was thick, almost palpable, as Cole stared at the map on the table. Ryder's words echoed in his head. He was already entangled in a situation he hadn't wanted, but this was no longer about avoiding trouble. The gold in those hills wasn't just a tale. It was real, and it had already attracted enough attention to turn Silver Ridge into a powder keg ready to explode. "Listen, Ryder," Cole said quietly, his eyes never leaving the map. "I left that life behind for a reason. I'm not interested in treasure hunting, and I sure as hell don't want to deal with the kind of men who are going to come looking for this." Ryder leaned forward again, his face close enough for Cole to see the shadows of his past etched in his features. "You can try to leave it behind, Cole, but you know as well as I do that this gold has a way of finding people. The kind of people who come looking for it don't ask questions, and they don't care who they hurt to get it. And you're going to have to decide if you're going to let them walk all over Silver Ridge or if you're going to stop them." Cole's fingers tightened on the edge of his glass as he considered Ryder's words. He didn't want to admit it, but deep down, he knew Ryder was right. The bandits who had been in town earlier were nothing compared to what was coming. This wasn't just a few robbers looking for a quick score. This was about men who would kill anyone in their path to get what they wanted. And Cole had been in enough firefights to know that when the stakes were high, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about deciding what you stood for. "I'm not some hero, Ryder," Cole said, his voice firm but weary. "I'm just trying to make sure my past doesn't catch up with me. I've already done enough damage." Ryder looked at him, his face unreadable. Then, with a sudden movement, he grabbed the map and shoved it back into his coat. "Fine. You can sit back and watch when the town burns." "But I won't." Cole's eyes narrowed. "So you're just going to march into town and take it all on yourself? Huh?" "I'm not alone in this," Ryder replied, his eyes flashing. "I've got men coming from the south. We'll take care of things. You just stay out of the way if you don't want to be part of it." Cole stood up, pushing his chair back with a harsh scrape against the floor. "You think I'll just let you walk out of here with that map? You're right about one thing. This town is going to burn, but not if I can help it." Ryder's grin returned, but this time it was more sinister. "You've always been a stubborn son of a bitch, Cole. I've missed that about you." The man with the poncho didn't respond. He just reached for his revolver, checking the barrel and spinning the cylinder. His fingers brushed the cold steel, a familiar sensation, one he hadn't felt in too long. Ryder held his hands up in mock surrender. "Easy now. We're on the same side." "For now." Cole said nothing, his gaze still hard, as he walked out of the saloon, leaving Ryder behind. The sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the town, and the quiet of the evening was unsettling. The calm before the storm. As he stepped into the street, Cole took a deep breath, scanning the horizon. The hills to the north were growing darker, and the weight of what was coming hung heavy in the air. He had made his decision. There was no more running from his past. The people of Silver Ridge had no idea what was about to hit them, but Cole did. And if there was even a chance of stopping it, he would take it. He had spent too long trying to outrun the ghosts of his past. But now, he'd face them head-on. Walking toward the sheriff's office, Cole knew he needed to talk to Sheriff Evans. The sheriff had always been a decent man, but Silver Ridge had never had much law and order. The sheriff was good with a badge, but he wasn't exactly equipped to handle the kind of storm that was brewing. Still, he was the best shot at keeping the town standing, even if it meant confronting Ryder's men and the outlaws they were sure to bring. The sheriff was sitting at his desk, looking over some paperwork when Cole walked in. The door creaked, and Sheriff Evans looked up, his expression wary but not surprised. "You here to tell me something I don't want to hear, Cole?" Sheriff Evans asked, leaning back in his chair. The man was getting older, his hair thinning, and his shoulders slumping from years of holding a town together with little more than good intentions and a badge that didn't mean much out here. Cole didn't waste time with pleasantries. "There's a storm coming, Sheriff. I don't think this town is ready for it." Evans raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. "You're talking about Ryder, aren't you?" Cole nodded. "And more. Ryder's got men, and they're coming for that gold in the hills north of here. But it's not just about the gold anymore. They'll take what they want, and they'll kill anyone who stands in their way." Sheriff Evans sighed, running a hand over his face. "I've heard the rumors, but what do you want me to do about it? You're a man who's been running for years. You don't have to get involved in this, Cole." Cole's eyes were hard, the weight of his decision clear. "I'm not running anymore, Sheriff. It's time someone did something. There was a long silence between them. Evans seemed to weigh the words carefully, knowing that asking Cole to walk away wasn't an option. The man in the poncho wasn't the kind of man who could turn his back when people were about to die. Finally, Evans spoke. "All right, you've got a point. What's your plan?" Cole didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window at the streets of Silver Ridge, the quiet before the storm. He could already hear the sounds of hooves in the distance, faint but unmistakable. "There's a pass to the north," Cole said. "We'll set up there. If we can stop them before they make it into town, we'll have a chance." Sheriff Evans nodded, his jaw tight. "All right, let's get to work then." The next few hours were a blur of preparation. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the town, Cole worked with Sheriff Evans and a handful of trusted townsfolk to set up a defensive position along the narrow pass leading into Silver Ridge. The Outlaws, Ryder and his men, were coming from the north, and Cole knew that if they reached the town, it would be too late to stop them. The plan was simple: use the geography of the hills and the pass to their advantage. The narrow path leading into the town was the perfect spot to make a stand. It would bottleneck the attackers, and if they could control the high ground, they'd have a fighting chance. But the success of this plan hinged on one thing: time. They needed to slow the bandits down long enough to get into position and make sure no one got past them. Cole worked swiftly, organizing the townsfolk into small, quiet teams. He wasn't asking anyone to be a hero, just to stand their ground, hold the line, and make sure the people of Silver Ridge survived. Most of the men in town weren't experienced fighters, but they knew the land, and that was going to have to be enough. As dusk settled, the quiet hum of nervous energy filled the air. Cole stood atop the ridge overlooking the pass, his back straight as he surveyed the scene. The breeze swept through the sagebrush, carrying with it the scent of dust and a promise of something worse to come. The man in the poncho was calm, as always, but deep inside, he felt the weight of what was coming. This wasn't just another fight. This was the last chance for Silver Ridge. "You all right?" Sheriff Evans asked, his voice breaking through Cole's thoughts. The sheriff had joined him on the ridge, his rifle slung across his back, his face lined with the same weariness Cole had seen in too many men who'd spent their lives trying to keep the peace in places like this. Cole didn't answer right away. He just scanned the horizon again, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He could feel the weight of the sheriff's question. Was he really ready for this? Was he ready to face what was coming? "I'll be fine," Cole said finally, his voice low. "But you need to get the townsfolk out of sight. We can't risk any civilians being caught in the crossfire." Evans nodded, his eyes hardening. "They've all been warned. They know what to do." Cole turned to face the sheriff, his expression unreadable. "We'll need to take out Ryder's scouts before they can warn the rest of the men. We need to be fast." Sheriff Evans let out a slow breath. "And if we can't hold them?" Cole didn't hesitate. "Then we fight anyway." The sheriff didn't reply. There was nothing more to say. The two men turned to the task at hand, moving quickly to the positions they had set up. Cole and a few of the townsfolk climbed higher into the rocks, finding good vantage points where they could keep watch over the narrow trail. Cole's revolvers were already loaded, and his rifle was resting against a boulder beside him. He knew the fight was coming, and he was prepared to meet it. Ryder's men would have the numbers, but they didn't know the land the way Cole and the townsfolk did. That was the only advantage they had. As long as they could take out the scouts and hold the pass, they had a shot at stopping the bandits before they could reach the town. As the light began to fade, Cole felt a familiar calm settle over him. His thoughts sharpened, the noise of the world around him fading into the background as he focused solely on what lay ahead. He had lived this way for too long to feel fear, but he wasn't without concern. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a fight for everything that had been built here. The people, the land, the life he had tried so hard to forget. A faint sound, the crunch of hooves on dry earth, broke the silence. Cole stiffened, his hand instinctively going to his revolver. The sound was distant, but it was unmistakable. The bandits were coming. He turned to Sheriff Evans. "Get ready," he said, his voice steady. "They'll be here soon." The sheriff nodded and moved back down the ridge, signaling to the others. The townsfolk were ready. They were scared, but they were ready. Cole's eyes never left the trail. The wind picked up again, rustling the sagebrush and carrying with it the scent of trouble. He could hear the horses in the distance, getting closer. Minutes later, the first of Ryder's men came into view. 2 riders, moving cautiously through the pass, their eyes scanning the area. They were moving slow, like they suspected an ambush, but didn't know where it would come from. Cole's fingers twitched around the grip of his revolver, but he held back, waiting for the right moment. One of the riders pulled ahead, veering slightly to the left, moving toward a narrow gap in the rocks. Cole could see the flash of his rifle as he moved, trying to get a better angle. Without hesitation, Cole drew his revolver and fired. The shot was perfect, clean and silent. The bandit's rifle flew out of his hands, and he screamed in pain as he tumbled off his horse, clutching his arm. The second rider cursed loudly and reined in his horse, pulling it to a stop. He drew his pistol, but by the time he had raised it, Cole had already taken aim again. One more shot, and the second bandit was down, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. The silence was thick, but it was short-lived. The remaining bandits, alerted by the gunfire, were coming. Sheriff Evans's voice rang out from below. "They're on us." The man in the poncho's heart raced, but his hand never wavered as he holstered his revolver and prepared for what was coming next. The sounds of hooves grew louder, echoing off the rocky cliffs and carrying through the narrow pass. Cole's heart beat in time with the approaching gallop. He wasn't surprised. Ryder's men had been warned, and now they were coming full force. The plan had always been simple: take out the scouts, hold the pass, and make them pay for what they were about to do to Silver Ridge. But as the sound of approaching riders swelled, Cole couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. The reality was setting in. There would be no easy way out of this fight. From his perch, Cole scanned the narrow trail below. The rocks were his friends now, providing him with cover as he waited for the next move. Sheriff Evans and the few townsfolk who had volunteered to fight were ready. They weren't soldiers, but they knew their land, and they knew the stakes. The first group of riders came into view, moving in a tight formation. They had learned from the previous ambush. No one had been caught off guard, but they hadn't seen the whole picture yet. Ryder's men rode 2 by 2, their rifles held high, eyes darting back and forth in search of any movement. Cole let them pass just out of range before signaling to the sheriff. He fired a warning shot, just a simple blast in the air, enough to get their attention but not enough to put them on full alert. The sound of the shot echoed off the cliffs, and the riders stopped, hesitating for just a moment. That was all Cole needed. He nodded to Evans, and the trap was sprung. The first bandit fell with a soft gasp, a bullet to the chest, before he even had time to shout a warning. His horse bucked under him, causing the man to tumble to the ground. Before the others could react, the second shot rang out, followed by 2 more, each finding its mark. The bandits scattered, disorganized, firing blindly into the rocks above them. But it was too late. They were trapped. Cole's sharpshooting and the townsfolk's surprise attack had given them the upper hand for now. "Hold your ground," Sheriff Evans yelled, his voice carrying through the chaos. He was down on one knee, firing with steady hands as he picked off the remaining riders, one by one. The rest of Ryder's men, seeing their comrades fall, were quick to regroup. They had to make a decision: retreat or push forward. But neither choice would be easy. Cole's revolver was quick and accurate, his movements sharp as he kept his fire consistent, picking off bandit after bandit. One bandit managed to break through, charging toward the ridge where Cole stood. His horse galloped with fury, but the man in the poncho wasn't fazed. He waited, calculated. As the rider approached, Cole's gun was already in motion. The bullet slammed into the rider's chest, and he fell, lifeless, from his horse, which continued its mad dash down the pass, scattering dust behind it. The noise of the battle filled the air. The gunfire was relentless, punctuated by the occasional shout or the squeal of a horse. It was chaos, but controlled chaos. Cole had seen worse, but there was something about defending a town, a group of people who depended on him, that was different. It made him fight harder, fight smarter. His revolver seemed to move of its own accord, the shots always landing true. The fear that might have paralyzed him in other moments had no place here. There was only the fight, the survival. Ryder's men, realizing the trap had been sprung, were now pinned down on both sides. They tried to retreat, but the hills around them were steep, and there were no easy paths back to safety. The narrow trail they'd entered by had become a death trap, with Cole and the sheriff covering the high ground while the townsfolk took shots from below. A shout from below caught Cole's attention. A group of bandits had made a break for it, attempting to flank their position. One of the townsfolk had been hit, nothing fatal, but enough to slow them down. "Ryder's still out there," Cole said to Sheriff Evans, his voice low, but with a hard edge. "We need to end this now." The sheriff nodded, his face grim. "We've got to push them back." Cole's eyes scanned the ridge. He could see the way things were unfolding. The bandits were in full retreat now, but they weren't broken. Ryder's men were tough, relentless, but they had been caught off guard, their numbers thinned, and their morale shattered. "There's more coming," Cole said quietly. His voice was steady, but his mind was already ahead, calculating their next move. Ryder wouldn't give up so easily. He would regroup and make one final push. The man in the poncho wasn't the type to back down. He had no intention of letting Ryder and his men take Silver Ridge, no matter the cost. He had spent too many years avoiding trouble, running from the things he had done. But this was the moment that would define him. This wasn't about redemption. It was about survival. Ryder was out there, and Cole knew the outlaw would never back down. The town had to be saved, and if it meant confronting his past head-on, Cole would face it, no matter what it took. "We finished this," Cole muttered to himself as he adjusted his hat and took a deep breath. He had no time for fear, only the fight. Ryder was coming, and Cole was ready for him. The wind had picked up, carrying dust and debris across the narrow pass. The battle raged on below, but the man in the poncho didn't flinch. His focus was steady, his revolvers drawn, his mind calculating every movement in the chaos. He had been in many fights, but this one felt different. The stakes were higher, and he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for the people of Silver Ridge. He had already killed enough men to know that there was no turning back. If they were going to survive, they had to stop Ryder and his men now, before they had the chance to regroup and retaliate. From his perch on the ridge, Cole saw the last of Ryder's men begin to fall back, their retreat becoming more frantic as the sheriff's men pushed forward. The gunfire had slowed, but it was still intense, each shot echoing through the pass, a harsh reminder of the price of survival. Cole's eyes darted to the horizon. He knew that this was far from over. Ryder hadn't shown himself yet, and that meant one thing. He was preparing for something bigger. The bandits had been scattered, but they were still a threat. "Sheriff," Cole called down to Evans, his voice carrying through the smoke and dust. The sheriff, still crouched behind a rock, glanced up at him. "What is it?" Evans shouted, his face grim. "We need to prepare for a counterattack," Cole said, his voice hard. "Ryder's not done yet. He's got more men, and they're going to try and break through here. We need to move fast." Sheriff Evans nodded and waved to the townsfolk, who had been holding their ground. They were tired, but they had shown their courage. "Listen up. We've got one more push coming. Get ready." Cole looked around quickly. There were still a few men left standing, bandits who hadn't been hit yet and were trying to regroup behind the cover of boulders and rocks. But they were disorganized, their retreat becoming less of a fight and more of a scramble for survival. Cole's hand went instinctively to his revolvers, checking them one last time. The cold steel of the barrels felt familiar in his grip, a reminder that he was still a man who lived by the gun. But that didn't mean he had to like it. The lives he had taken, the men he had killed, it all weighed on him, even if he hadn't allowed himself to think about it in years. But this town, these people, had done nothing to deserve the kind of violence Ryder was bringing. There was no time for regret now. There was only what was in front of him. A shout from below broke his train of thought. A rider had appeared on the horizon. Ryder himself, silhouetted against the fading light of the day. He was on horseback, a wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. But there was no mistaking him. Ryder was the kind of man who didn't just survive in the West. He thrived in it. He had the look of someone who knew how to control a fight, how to break a man's spirit before he ever pulled the trigger. Cole's grip tightened on his revolvers, his eyes narrowing as he watched Ryder's men begin to regroup behind him, their faces tense with determination. "You ready for this?" Sheriff Evans asked, stepping up beside Cole, his voice low but filled with resolve. Cole didn't answer. Instead, he scanned the approaching riders, his mind calculating the best angle of attack. There were only a handful of them left, but Ryder was dangerous. He was the kind of man who would make sure every one of his men fought to the death, and Cole had no doubt that he'd come prepared for the fight of his life. "I'll take the left side," Cole said quietly, his eyes still locked on Ryder. "You take the right." Evans gave a grim nod. "Let's make it count." The battle wasn't over yet, but Cole could already feel the pull of fate, the certainty that this would be the final fight. There was no room for mistakes. Not this time. If they didn't finish it here, Ryder's men would push into Silver Ridge, and that would be the end of the town. It had to end here. With a final glance at the sheriff, Cole took a step forward, his boots crunching against the dry earth. He knew what he had to do. He had faced down gunslingers before, but this time was different. This wasn't just about winning. This was about protecting what he had left, and maybe, just maybe, finding redemption. As Cole moved into position, he could feel the tension building. Ryder's men were close now, their horses kicking up dust as they rode toward the pass. Cole's hand hovered near his revolver, his eyes darting between the riders. He could hear the sound of their hooves growing louder, the rhythm of their gallop steady and sure. The wind picked up, blowing dust across his face, but Cole didn't flinch. He'd been through worse. Suddenly, Ryder's voice rang out, cutting through the chaos. "You think you've won, Cole?" he shouted, his voice carrying across the pass. "You can't stop us. We've got more men coming, and you're gonna bleed just like the rest of them." Cole didn't flinch. He didn't say a word. Instead, he drew his revolver and took aim. Ryder's men were just in range now, too close for comfort. "Let's finish this," Cole muttered to himself before squeezing the trigger. The first shot rang out. Ryder's lead rider was hit in the chest, falling from his horse before he could even make a move. Chaos erupted as the remaining bandits scrambled for cover, realizing they were outmatched. Ryder's eyes locked onto Cole from across the battlefield, and the two men stared each other down for a long moment. No words were exchanged, just the knowledge that the final confrontation had come. And then, like a predator closing in on its prey, Cole fired again. The crack of Cole's revolver echoed through the narrow pass, a loud, sharp sound that rang off the rocks like the strike of a bell. The first rider, caught off guard, pitched forward and collapsed from his saddle, lifeless before his body hit the ground. His horse continued to gallop, spinning in confusion as the chaos unfolded around it. The remaining bandits, their faces twisted with fury and fear, scrambled for cover. They hadn't expected to meet resistance this fierce. For all their bravado, they had underestimated the man in the poncho. The bandits weren't used to being outgunned, and they quickly found themselves on the back foot. Ryder's face twisted in frustration as he spurred his horse forward, barking orders to his men to press the attack. He was a seasoned outlaw, the kind who had fought his way through the frontier for years, and he wasn't one to back down easily. His eyes locked onto Cole from across the battlefield, the two men exchanging a silent challenge. It was clear that Ryder wasn't going to retreat, not while he had the upper hand. But Cole wasn't concerned about Ryder's bluster. His focus was unwavering, his hands steady as he took another shot, downing one of Ryder's men as he tried to close the gap. The remaining bandits scattered in all directions, some charging toward the ridge, others seeking shelter behind the rocks. The fight was quickly becoming a whirlwind of dust, gunfire, and shouting. "Take cover," Sheriff Evans shouted, ducking low behind the boulders. He popped up just enough to fire a shot, hitting one of Ryder's men in the shoulder. The man screamed, clutching his wound, but he didn't go down. Cole had to act fast. The town was counting on him to end this, to put an end to Ryder's reign of terror once and for all. But it wasn't going to be easy. Ryder was a cunning man, and Cole knew better than anyone that outlaws like him didn't go down without a fight. Cole moved quickly, his boots crunching against the dry earth as he darted from cover to cover. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his heart pounding in his chest as the final confrontation unfolded before him. Ryder was close now, charging toward the ridge where Cole had taken position. The man in the poncho took a deep breath, then rose from behind the rocks just enough to take aim. Ryder was still riding hard, his face set in a determined sneer. He had to be close now, within range. Cole waited, patience thick in his chest, his eyes narrowed on Ryder's every move. Then, in a split second, Cole fired. The shot rang out, louder than any of the others. Ryder's horse screamed and reared up, throwing him off balance. Ryder himself lurched to the side, but he didn't fall. He was still on his feet, struggling to regain control of his mount, his eyes flicking toward the ridge where Cole stood. "Not today, Ryder," Cole muttered under his breath. His revolver was already drawn, and in one smooth, fluid motion, he took another shot. This time, it was precise. The bullet hit Ryder in the shoulder, sending him tumbling from his horse and crashing to the dirt. For a moment, there was silence. The sounds of battle stopped, the air heavy with anticipation. Ryder lay on the ground, struggling to rise, his face contorted in pain. He looked up, meeting Cole's eyes, and for the first time, the swagger and confidence that had defined him throughout the battle faltered. Cole walked slowly toward him, his boots dragging in the dirt, the weight of his decision settling over him like a heavy cloak. Ryder reached for his gun, his fingers trembling, but Cole was faster. He stepped forward, his revolver drawn, and in a swift motion, pointed it directly at Ryder's chest. Ryder's eyes widened, his mouth opening in defiance, but no words came out. He could feel the weight of the barrel against his chest, the cold steel a reminder that his time was up. "This is where it ends," Cole said quietly, his voice low and emotionless. Ryder let out a rasping breath, his eyes narrowing as he realized there was no escape. For a long moment, neither man moved. The battle around them had quieted, the surviving bandits looking on, uncertain of what to do next. Ryder's men were falling apart, their leader vulnerable and defeated. "I've been through worse than you, Cole," Ryder muttered, his voice weak but defiant. "You don't have the guts to pull that trigger." Cole's finger tightened on the trigger, but he didn't pull it just yet. His eyes remained fixed on Ryder, the man who had once been a ghost from his past. The man who had pushed him into a corner, forced him to remember things he tried to forget. "I don't need to," Cole replied. "You've already lost." In a final, fluid motion, Cole pulled the trigger. The shot was clean. Ryder's body jerked once, and then he was still, his eyes empty and lifeless, staring at the man who had ended his reign of terror. For a long moment, Cole stood there, the weight of the decision heavy on him. The sound of hooves in the distance grew quieter as the remaining bandits realized the fight was over. Ryder's men were scattered, and the rest of the outlaws had been defeated or forced to flee. Sheriff Evans approached, his rifle still in hand, his face grim. "It's over," he said quietly, looking at the body of Ryder. Cole didn't respond. He was already turning away, his eyes scanning the town. Silver Ridge had been spared, this time, but there was a part of him that knew the fight was never truly over. Outlaws didn't stop. They just moved on to the next town, the next challenge, the next fight. As the dust settled and the townsfolk began to gather around, Cole knew what had to be done. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. He didn't belong in Silver Ridge, not for long. He had already made his mark, and it was time to move on again. Cole reached down, holstering his revolver, and without a word, he turned and walked away. The quiet man in the poncho was gone, his past finally behind him, but the legacy of the town would live on. Silver Ridge stood in the twilight of its fate, the dust of battle still hanging heavy in the air. The faint smell of gunpowder lingered like an unwelcome guest, but there was a quiet calm now, one that settled over the town like a heavy blanket. The few remaining survivors of the skirmish with Ryder's men had either fled into the hills or were taken into custody. Those who had fallen were laid to rest with the kind of quiet reverence that spoke volumes about the people who lived here. Sheriff Evans stood in the middle of Main Street, watching as the townsfolk worked together to clear the debris and rebuild. The saloon, which had seen its share of bloodshed that day, was now quiet again. The piano player, who had hidden in the back during the battle, sat at the keys, his fingers tentatively tapping a soft, mournful tune. One that didn't quite fit, but echoed with the melancholy of the day's events. Evans rubbed his face with a weary hand, his gaze lifting to the horizon. It was quiet now, but he knew better than to think it would stay that way forever. This town had always been a place where the law was a loose concept, one that people had to take into their own hands. And now, they'd learned that their survival depended not just on the sheriff's badge, but on the willingness of everyone to stand and fight when the time came. "I never thought I'd see the day we'd make it through something like this," Evans muttered to no one in particular. As the townsfolk worked, one figure remained on the outskirts, a silhouette that seemed to blur into the horizon. The man in the poncho, Cole. He had watched the events unfold, his work done. It was a strange thing, this feeling of finality, but even stranger was the realization that for once, it wasn't the battle that left the deepest impression. It was the silence after it. The town had survived, and for that, Cole felt a sense of peace, a peace he hadn't known in years. Cole stood alone for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the faces of those he had just helped protect. There was a feeling of relief, yes, but also a quiet sadness. They had won, but the cost of that victory wasn't just measured in the blood spilled. It was the realization that life, here and now, was fragile. No one in Silver Ridge could ever forget what had transpired. He turned his back on the town, the sun beginning to set behind the hills, casting the land in a warm amber glow. His footsteps, as quiet as they had always been, took him toward the edge of town, where the road stretched out, leading into the open desert. For a moment, Cole hesitated, looking back one last time. The town was bustling with its own kind of recovery, people talking in hushed voices, others working to rebuild what had been broken. Life was already returning to normal, but it was a new kind of normal. They had learned something in the heat of battle, something that would change the way they lived. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were a community, bound by the same struggles, the same victories. But Cole knew that his place was not here. Not anymore. He had done what he came to do, and for all the town's gratitude, he wasn't one to stick around long after the smoke had cleared. He had a road ahead of him, one that led away from Silver Ridge, one that called him out into the wilderness where he would remain. The quiet man in the poncho, until the next storm came calling. As he walked down the road, he felt the weight of his past. The ghosts of men he had killed, the lives he had taken, the people he had left behind. It had been a long time since he had been able to walk away from the things that haunted him. But for the first time in years, he felt something else stirring inside him, a glimmer of hope. The weight had lifted, if only for a moment. In Silver Ridge, the sun set on a town that had fought back and won. It wasn't a perfect victory. It wasn't without loss, but it was a victory nonetheless. And for the people of Silver Ridge, that was enough. And so, Cole walked into the horizon, the last traces of daylight casting long shadows behind him, leaving Silver Ridge to rebuild, to heal, and to move forward. In his wake, there was only the promise of the road ahead. The same road that had led him here and the one that would carry him far from the town he had saved. But he knew something now, something deep inside him, that he hadn't before. In the quiet after the storm, there was peace. And maybe, just maybe, there was a place where a man like him could find rest. It was just a matter of finding it. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.